If there's one takeaway message from my talk today, it's two words: think differently. I think that applies to a lot of animal issues, and certainly about the one that I'm going to talk to you about today. My topic is alternatives to wildlife in captivity, but I wanted to talk a little bit, not about a project that's illustrated on the panels at the back there. I will mention that a little later, but I wanted to talk about one that we pitched very recently in a real-life scenario. But first I wanted to tell you a little bit about the animal that it's involving, and that animal is the polar bear. And we know that polar bears are iconic animals for the North and for Canada, that they're extremely wide-ranging. They have these wonderful adaptations for living in extreme cold weather. They have up to 4 inches or 10 centimeters of blubber. They have an outer coat of fur, of guard hairs. They have inner fur. They have large paddle-like feet. I won't go through all the adaptations that they have, but they are remarkably well adapted to living in a cold environment, and in fact can overheat when they're in temperatures that are as low as 0 degrees Celsius. These are animals that need to be in the Arctic. They define the Arctic, and they are defined by the Arctic and the cold weather. Now, in captivity around the world, these animals face all kinds of problems. Some of them are born in captivity, some of them are caught from the wild, but all of them face problems, and problems with these animals are pretty much ubiquitous in the world of captivity. And I wanted to just run through a very brief list of some of these problems. The first is lack of space. As I mentioned, polar bears are really wide-ranging animals, and their ranges in the wild, at the low end of the scale, that would be the Beaufort sea bears, would be about 2,300 square kilometers. At the high end of the scale, if you're looking at a nomadic pack ice bear that's living its entire existence on moving pack ice, you're looking at something in the neighborhood of about 599,000 square kilometers. So that's bigger than the province of Manitoba. These are animals that need lots of space, and if you look at how we treat them when we bring them into captive situations, you see that they're in spaces that are orders of magnitude smaller. And in fact, the biggest captive polar bear space in the world is more than 4 million times smaller than the smallest home range in the wild. So we compress them into these microscopic habitats, and I think it's ludicrous that we think they can do well or not experience all kinds of problems. Next. So in addition to space, we also have a number of bears, and I'll tell you the relevance of some of these things as we move on, that go from the north to the south. And we see this in the world of captivity. A lot of animals that are ill-suited to particular climates that are moved to those climates, and they suffer as a result. And we have all kinds of bears like these bears that I saw in Taman Safari, Indonesia, which is a safari park near Jakarta. And it was hot all day long, every day. So it would be in excess of 90 degrees Fahrenheit or 30 degrees Celsius, and these bears would lie either spread-eagled or prone on the concrete surface trying to stay cool, but of course they had no relief, no way to seek salvation from the heat, so they just suffered as a result. So you get a lot of this kind of situation. And you get a lot of situations where they have also high humidity. So you can have dry heat and wet heat, but when there's wet heat, there's all kinds of problems that result. And some of them aren't necessarily problematic from a health sense, if you look at it from the bear's perspective, like the green algae. But you got to ask, if these animals are being used as ambassadors for their species to educate people, then maybe they should actually look like their counterparts in the wild. At the Nagoya Zoo in Japan, this is an example of a bear, and there's all kinds of green polar bears all over the world. And it's the humidity causes algae to grow in the guard hairs of the bear, which are clear hairs, but they're hollow, so the algae grows in the hairs. And whenever you see the greenness, you know that there's a bit of a problem with the environment. You get for polar bears hard and flexible environments, and these are a holdover from this belief that they lived on the pack ice. But if you ever go up to Churchill or go up to the Arctic and you walk on the pack ice, you see it's all different consistencies and textures, and there's ice ridges and there's open water. It's a really varied kind of landscape, even though at first, intuitively, you might think, oh, it's ice, it's hard. It's not. It is very different. It's just like walking down terrain in the south. But in zoos, we get these replica ice sculptures and ice platforms and all that. Some of them are to replicate coastlines, others pack ice, but they're hard and inflexible, and that's not good for any animal, certainly not polar bears. You get lack of stimulation, and this is a big one for all kinds of animals in our lives. It's dogs and cats, it's animals in pet stores, it's in the zoo, it's in the farm, it's in the laboratory, it's everywhere. Lack of stimulation. Well, polar bears are exceedingly intelligent, they're curious, they're active, they do things, they have very complex survival behaviors in terms of hunting and foraging if there are bears that inhabit coastlines or boreal forest. They have a tremendous need for stimulation, but most of them that you see in zoos, including here in Canada, they're just lying around because they have nothing to do. So lack of stimulation is a big problem. And another thing that a lot of people don't know about is that when you go to a zoo, a lot of times the animals that you're looking at during the day, when the keepers go home, they're put in at night into very small spaces. And this is one bear we're trying to get out of Mexico right now named Yuppie, who's actually becoming quite famous. And things are looking a bit brighter for Yuppie. But Yuppie would go into this small, unlit bare concrete room at 4 p.m. and get out at 10 a.m. the next morning. So Yuppie actually spent most of her, or is spending most of her life in this small room. These are some of the problems that are ubiquitous for polar bears. Next. Now, a few years ago, I got a call from Vicki Burns at the Winnipeg Humane Society that alerted me to the fact that there was this polar bear cub at the Winnipeg airport, and it was being shipped out from Manitoba to some zoo. And she was very concerned about this. And we started to look into this together, and it ended up with this whole campaign that was looking at bears that were exported out of Manitoba. And I won't go into the sort of the whole program that resulted in these bears being available for export, but they came from Churchill, Manitoba, and generally they were orphans or what were considered problem adult bears that were snatched up by the Wildlife Department and then sent to the Assiniboine Park Zoo in Winnipeg and then exported out. And the government had said, when we inquired at first, oh, they're wonderful ambassadors, they're going to great homes, they have wonderful lives, and this is just a good news story all the way around. Well, we investigated, and we found out that a lot of the places that the bears were going to were not very good at all. And in fact, a lot of them were like this. This is a very old picture of the Riverdale Zoo in Toronto from the 1800s. And a lot of people think that there's nothing like this anymore. But if you look at modern exhibits where all these bears have been going to, you find that they're really just sort of variations of what existed in the past. So we sent investigators all over the world to follow some of these bears. We were able to piece together through freedom of information legislation. We acquired information. We were able to do a little bit of detective work and found about 15 facilities where the bears had been exported to. We didn't believe the government. We said, we got to get people out there. So we sent people to all these places. The Chapultepec Zoo in Mexico City was just facility that had received a Canadian bear, and it was just an old grotto with rocks at the front and a moat and people looking across, a very antiquated kind of exhibit. And they actually had a Canadian bear that had an infection, lost a leg, so they had this three-legged polar bear that was kept off exhibit as well. We found these very old-style island exhibits, like this one at the Lisbon Zoo, which received a bear. Just basically an island of rock, not at all suitable for polar bears, and you know, if you apply some of the things I mentioned earlier, you see that they don't really have any of those. Next. We even found 3 bears that had gone through a conduit in Germany called the Ruhr Zoo that ended up in a circus in Central America. Some of you may know the story of the Suarez 7. Eventually they were rescued. There was one bear died basically during the rescue process, but these bears were rescued and are in better conditions now. So we found that there were all these problems, and next. And one of the worst that we found were bears that had went to Taiwan that had developed a climate-induced skin condition and ended up covered in scabs and scratching themselves silly, and eventually they both died. Well, we were successful in convincing the government to stop the exports, and they changed the export program. But now there's a new threat because there's a number of US zoos in conjunction with some NGOs that are trying to reopen up the polar bear trade. And they want them to send the polar bears from Churchill to places like this. And these are called Arctic Ambassador Centers by one of the groups involved. And they feel that having polar bears in captivity will help people learn about climate change and all that. I think it's a lot of nonsense, but this is what they're claiming. This is one of their Arctic Ambassador Centers, the Buffalo Zoo. Another one at the Toledo Zoo, an $8 million exhibit that really is just a replication, a bad replication of what occurred in the past. SeaWorld in Orlando, again, you know, just pretty much the same as you saw in the past. Next. And if you look at some of these exhibits, you see that they are really, really small. I mentioned the home ranges of polar bears in nature, and the fact that bears in captivity have spaces that are orders of magnitude smaller. Most of them are much smaller than a tennis court. And the standard under the province of Manitoba, under their new Polar Bear Protection Act, which came in 2002, is this, 500 meters squared, so 0.123 acres. Not very much space for a polar bear. But the groups that are trying to get the polar bears out of Manitoba now feel this is entirely appropriate, and they're now lobbying the US government to try to relax restrictions for polar bear imports under the Endangered Species Act so they can bring them in. And I just wanted to just very quickly mention the enormous costs of keeping polar bears in captivity in zoo environments. That if you look at some of these exhibits, you'll look that here you have Como Zoo, 0.3 acres at 20 million. SeaWorld Australia, 6.5 million. Toledo Zoo, 8.7. Some of these exhibits for polar bears are upwards of $50, $60 million. Very expensive places, and there are alternatives. There are much better facilities elsewhere that actually consider some of the needs of polar bears that cost a lot less, including the Highland Wildlife Park, which is one of the better ones in Europe, which I'll show you a couple of pictures of, that ended up, because of donations, costing about $54,000. And it's much better than any of these that cost tens of millions. This is all actually a setup for the alternatives. So next. Just a few quick pictures of some of these better facilities. The Highland Wildlife Park had the last polar bear in Britain named Mercedes. Quite a nice 4-acre exhibit full of trees and mature forest and scrub and areas to dig and all that. And that's Mercedes. Another picture of Mercedes pushing through a relatively complex environment, you know, that's totally and completely different from the old sort of hard exhibit scenario of the past. Here in Ontario, this is actually the facility we're trying to get Yupi, the Mexican polar bear, to. It's the Cochrane Polar Bear Facility up north of Timmins. And it's a multi-acre facility. They do plan to build it bigger, and it's natural ground. And next slide. They've got different kinds of terrain. It's much bigger than any zoo facility in North America. And the polar bears get to do things. This is not a polar bear. Back. This is actually one of the dens that one of the polar bears had dug and slept in the entire winter. So you can see, you know, they actually had things to do. They didn't have rock. They had earth to dig in. They were filthy, but they loved it. And there's a couple in Europe. The Orsa Bear Park in Sweden, which is a 10-acre facility, which is very unlike any zoo. Next. You can see that there's large areas of natural terrain. You know, this is the kind of situation you want a bear in if you're going to keep a bear. Next. And you want lots of complexity of terrain and environment so that they have choices and they have an ability to make a meaningful contribution to the quality of their own lives because they have control just like we do. So next.